We're going to talk about hemispheric relations, the United States relationship with Latin American nations in the 1930s. This is exclusively paper 3 stuff for us. I'm not going to talk too much about what's going on up in Canada because the IB lets me pick Latin America or Canada to specifically focus on. We're going to go a little bit more Latin American way. First, let's talk about Franklin Roosevelt, elected president in 1932. All right. And it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. A lot of kids like to say Delano because I think they get his name confused with his wife, Eleanor Roosevelt. So it's Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Elected in 1932 for the first time. He will win 4 presidential elections. Okay, he's the only president to ever win more than 2 presidential elections. And after he went nuts and was president for 12 years, we changed the Constitution so that couldn't happen again. We amended the Constitution to limit a president to 2 terms in office. He's elected in 1932. Just a side note to kind of keep in mind as we go through this year. We elect presidents every 4 years. We know this. But one thing we may not have thought about, but I want you to keep in mind for this year, is those 4 years just so happened, because of when we started doing it, those 4 years happen to fall on multiples of 4 years. All right? So like 1900 was a presidential election year. 04, 08, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32, all right? So it's just a mathematical coincidence, but it's going to come in handy for us to remember because presidential politics, American presidential politics, will often have great impact on how the United States is reacting to big issues around the world. Remember in 1916, who would have been running for president? What big events going on in 1916? World War I. So who's running for re-election in 1916? Woodrow Wilson. And in the 1916 election, he's running on a campaign pledge of keeping us out of the European war. He wins that election. He doesn't have to worry about another election. So he then ultimately brings the United States into the war. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. So he's elected president in 1932, but then I have 1933 here. It's because presidents are inaugurated in the following year. So it used to be in March, but now it's in January. For him, it would have been January 20th of 1933. He's inaugurated as president. And what is he dealing with as a new president? The Great Depression. Not war yet. Certainly there's issues going on in Asia. By 1933, he knows that Japan has invaded Manchuria. He knows that's an issue. He knows of Adolf Hitler as the Chancellor of Germany in 1933. He knows that that is there. But his primary concern has got to be dealing with the Great Depression that's been an issue in the United States since 1929 and even before. So that is his primary concern. And when he comes into office, Franklin Roosevelt, what we call his first 100 days, that 100 days was exclusively spent dealing with domestic economic issues. All right? So that's what he's dealing with. And he's also got a fiercely isolationist Congress. All right? A Congress, well, let me not call it isolationist because we don't want to get too bogged down in that word. The United States was an isolationist nation in the sense that we didn't want to get involved in European affairs or Asian affairs. We were still doing business around the world. We still had diplomats around the world, so we're not completely closed off. Let's call us, rather than isolationists, or at least add this other word in there, we were non-interventionists. We didn't want to get involved in other people's business outside of the Americas. But the events of the Great Depression, and certainly the rising tensions in Europe and in Asia, are going to make Franklin Roosevelt look a little bit more within his own hemisphere. And Franklin Roosevelt will employ a foreign policy in the Americas, particularly Latin America, called the Good Neighbor Policy, sponsored by State Farm. I don't know if they were probably a company back then, but I don't know. So Roosevelt, that was bad? No good? Okay. Wait, it gets worse. Roosevelt's Good Neighbor Policy is Roosevelt's program to create better economic ties and better diplomatic relations between the United States and Latin American nations. Because if the stuff is hitting the fan in Europe, if the stuff is hitting the fan in Asia, Roosevelt wants the Americas to be cool, and he wants the Americas to all be on the same page. Can anybody think of any instance where a European crisis tried at least to make its way into an American crisis? Yes, ma'am? It would be the Zimmerman Note. Can you remind me of the Zimmerman Note? Because I forget.
Wasn't it a note that was intercepted by the British that was intended for...
Intended to go to Mexico, coming from? Germany, and encouraging Mexico to do what? Invade the southern United States, to tie up America as Germany is going to resume unrestricted submarine warfare, and that could draw us into the war. So to keep us preoccupied. Franklin Roosevelt's not a dumb guy. He knows this. So he wants the Americas to all be on the same page. He doesn't want any Latin American nation to look at the United States and see an enemy or see somebody that they could possibly benefit from striking against or joining some European nation to target. He doesn't want that. And the history that the United States had previously created in Latin America wasn't making a ton of friends. All right? I'm not going to go over everything you guys talked about last year, but I'm going to remind you of some of the names and ideas. Teddy Roosevelt and big stick diplomacy. All right, remember that speak softly, carry a big stick, the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. Look up your notes last year to remind yourselves of some of these things. That the United States saw ourselves as the dominant player in the Western Hemisphere, and we felt absolutely in our right to influence Latin American politics so they would go the way we needed them to go, so they would benefit our own self-interest. You remember talking last year about Panama, about how the United States wanted to dig a canal through the Isthmus of Panama, the narrowest strip of land in the Americas, so we could get around, so we could avoid having to travel around South America to get to the Pacific. And we orchestrated a revolution of Panamanians from Colombia, because Panama and Colombia used to be one. Do you guys recall this? And we promised Panamanian independence, but that independence came with a lot of strings attached, like our control of the canal zone and our further influence of Panamanian politics. You might remember after the Spanish-American War, the United States helped to promise Cuban liberation from Spain. But that came with strings attached, strings called the Platt Amendment, which you guys read about. The Platt Amendment essentially was the United States telling Cuba, you are independent, but if ever you have a government that doesn't support the ideals that the Cuban people should support, and certainly the ideals that the American people support, or the American government supports, the United States holds the right to intervene, right? So all of these different, we are in a number of Latin American countries militarily, like Nicaragua, and we are influencing the politics of those states. Woodrow Wilson and his ideas of moral diplomacy, you guys might remember this, where the United States would try to spread our moral idealism. But in many cases, that is going to usurp what some individual Latin American nations want for their own countries. All right? So while Wilson is talking about ideas of self-determination on one hand, he's working to influence and in some cases control Latin American politics. So our history in Latin America prior to the 1930s was one of dominant America and submissive Latin American countries. Franklin Roosevelt wants to change this. And the Great Depression is kind of forcing the change. America's economy is in shambles. Under the Hoover administration, we talked about this the other day, the United States passed one of the largest tariff bills in American history called the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, which dramatically increased taxes on imported goods. And this obviously made trade with Latin American countries more challenging. And he's got a Congress that does not want to be a part of the international community, that wants to stay more insular. So Franklin Roosevelt, as the United States chief diplomat, as the President of the United States, is going to start working with Latin American countries to try to mend those relations, and we call it his good neighbor policy. All right? And this is good stuff, guys, because a couple years ago we didn't teach this. And kids went into the IB Paper 3 exam hoping that they could write about some question about World War II. And the question they got was to write all about Roosevelt's good neighbor policy. And those kids back then never even heard of it. Now you guys will. All right? So the good neighbor policy, this is like the main part one of today's discussion. All right? And this is going to come through a series of meetings and a series of dealings that I hope you guys can maybe remember a couple of them. First of all, in 1933, Franklin Roosevelt will go to Montevideo, Uruguay, in what is known as the Inter-American Conference. The Inter-American Conference. The Inter-American Conference, where the United States and Latin American nations will enter into agreement that no nation has the right to intervene in the external or internal affairs of another nation. And this is largely directed at what country that has been doing most of the intervention? It's us. So this is Franklin Roosevelt saying, we are done with that old stuff, because now we're good neighbors. This is going to be a dramatic change from previous American policies like big stick diplomacy and moral diplomacy of Roosevelt and Wilson. So as the years press on, the United States will start pulling military troops out of places like Haiti and Costa Rica, or pardon me, Haiti and the Dominican Republic, and Nicaragua, that we had troops stationed to try to influence political regimes in those countries. In 1934, we will nullify most of the Platt Amendment with Cuba, getting out of Cuban political affairs. Supposedly, we're not completely going to leave, but this is what we're saying. We'll talk more about Cuba later in the year. And in fact, we're always in Cuba. We've always been in Cuba. One little agreement worked out with the whole Cuban independence thing is that the United States is going to have a permanent lease on a naval base in Cuba. Anybody know the name of that naval base? Guantanamo Bay. Very good. And we still, of course, have that. We're going to work on some new trade agreements with Latin American countries that will repeal some of the isolationist trade agreements that the United States had drafted earlier. You guys read about something called the Reciprocal Trade Agreement. Just meant to lower trade barriers, the Reciprocal Trade Agreement of 1934. In 1936, the United States is going to renegotiate the Panama Canal Treaty with Panama. We still are going to be in control of the canal zone. We will still be in control of the canal zone, but we are going to promise to get out of Panamanian politics. And we will stop making moves to take over more territory around the canal zone. We're a good neighbor now. We're good guys. In 1936, Franklin Roosevelt will go to Latin America himself, spending an entire month touring Latin America. First time an American president had done something like this, certainly for so long. 1936, the world is starting to look a little bit different. And it's going to become even more important for Franklin Roosevelt to make sure Latin American countries are standing with the United States, not standing against them. What in 1936 is making Franklin Roosevelt feel like we need stronger diplomatic relations with Latin American states? Because this stuff seems like it is going to get ready to hit the fan. Yes? Hitler is, by this point in 1936, he has remilitarized the Rhineland. Yes. Yes. Very good. Japan in 1931 goes into Manchuria, and Italy in 1935 goes into Abyssinia in Africa. So it's starting to look a little dicey in Europe. This is pressing the issue for Roosevelt to act with his Latin American partners. So Roosevelt calls for a peace conference, and this comes in Buenos Aires. What country? Argentina. Very good. In 1936. Yes, sir.
Was Argentina fascist yet?
Was Argentina fascist yet? No, they were cool with us. The results of this meeting and this Latin American tour of Roosevelt is that all American nations are going to agree to stand together and consult each other on hemispheric security threats. So if somebody from the outside is messing with the security of anybody in the Western Hemisphere here, we will talk it out with everybody. It's kind of like creating a little League of Nations for just the American states. And also a Neutrality Pact will be signed, where these Latin American nations and the United States agree to be neutral in the face of any European war. Because you guys could see how it could be problematic if there is a European war, and people are thinking that this could possibly happen now. If there is a European war, and like say the United States is on Team Britain again, and say Brazil joins Team Germany, do we see how that could be problematic for the Americas? So the Americas say, we are neutral. We're staying out of it. But we're going to stand together if anybody threatens our collective security. I saw a hand back here.
I was going to ask what collective security is.
Excellent. Great word that we really want to make sure we have down. Collective security is the idea that many nations will join together to guarantee the security of all of those nations. All right? This was the hope of the League of Nations, that by joining the League of Nations, if anybody threatened a League of Nations member state, all League of Nations members would be pressed to react to that. Unfortunately for the League of Nations, that didn't work out so well, as the Manchurian incident or the Abyssinian crisis proved. So this is an attempt at collective security in the Americas. Yes?
So you said the U.S. is trying to pull out of like South America and Latin America diplomatically, but do they also do that economically?
No. We're actually, through the good neighbor policy, we're not pulling out of Latin America diplomatically or economically. What we are doing is we are going to try to end our punishing trade barriers that we've erected in Latin America. So we're going to try to limit those. And we are going to stop trying to influence the politics of Latin American states. That doesn't mean we won't practice diplomacy. That's what Roosevelt is doing here. This is all diplomacy. So we are totally, good neighbor policy is all about diplomacy. But the difference is, rather than in previous years, under previous administrations saying, we are going to orchestrate how the government of this nation looks, now we are going to talk with the government of that nation to try to come to a mutual agreement. All right? Because we have a vested self-interest in staying out of European affairs and sticking together for mutual defense. All right? In 1938, there'll be another meeting. I don't have a picture for that one. In 1938, there'll be another meeting, this time in Lima, Peru. 1938, the 8th Pan-American Conference. The 8th Pan-American. All American states, right? The 8th Pan-American Conference in Lima, Peru. A further attempt to establish collective security in the Americas. And it is at this conference in 1938, and remember, things are getting even hairier in 1938, right? Now the Anschluss is happening. And now Adolf Hitler's got his eyes on the Sudetenland. It's even getting nastier in 1938. So at the Pan-American Conference of 1938, the United States and other Latin American allies will sign a Declaration of Solidarity with America. Solidarity means to stand together. Declaration of Solidarity of America, where these Latin American countries and the United States agree on ideas of cooperation and mutual self-defense. Or mutual defense, pardon me. So if anybody threatens any Latin American nation, other member states step up. Also, and you don't need to write all 4 of these down, please just hear them. There will also be a declaration of principles of these American states signed at this Pan-American Conference. That member states won't intervene in other states' affairs. Largely directed at us, right? Staying out of Latin American business. That any differences we have amongst ourselves will be settled diplomatically. We will talk about differences. We will not use force to settle our differences. And we will agree to cooperate with each other internationally. Everybody good? So, theme of the day 1, Franklin Roosevelt with Latin American countries and his good neighbor policy, trying to create better relationships, because if the stuff is going to hit the fan in Europe, we want the Americas to be cool. And whose side are we going to take in a European war? Nobody. Neutrality is the name of the day, or word of the day. All right, so we move on to the next topic, and that is neutrality in the United States. Now we're going to look more at United States politics. This is actually Gerald Nye, the neutrality guy. All right, it was a very unpopular children's show in the 1930s. All right. In the 1930s, the United States, we already mentioned the American Congress wrestling with a Great Depression. Absolutely, the majority opinion in Congress is to stay out of European affairs. And as things get hotter in Europe, America is going to seem to want to stay further detached from European issues. 1934, the United States Congress will create a committee led by this American senator named Gerald Nye. It's going to be called the Nye Committee. And this committee is tasked with looking into the reasons that the United States joined the First World War. Now, you talked last year about the reasons the United States joined the First World War. And we talked about issues like unrestricted submarine warfare. And we talked about issues like the Zimmerman telegram. And we talked about issues like, you know, a lot more in common with Britain than with Germany. Well, the Nye Committee knew all those things, but they were tasked with looking a little bit deeper, especially into the financial reasons that the United States got involved in the First World War. So the Nye Committee does its research and ultimately issues its results. And the Nye Committee report was harshly critical of American business interests' involvement in the European war and the American government's financial ties to one country in particular. Remember when World War I was being fought? Great Britain's got the biggest navy in the world, by far. And what do they do with that navy? They blockade Germany. We call it the British blockade, right? So Germany has a very hard time getting any goods from outside to Germany, which is part of the reason the other day we talked about Adolf Hitler needing Lebensraum, because he needs to get his resources internally. When the big war comes, he can't rely on getting it from overseas. Well, when World War I started, the United States was a neutral party. We didn't pick a side. And we were trying to sell things to anybody we could sell things to. But due to the nature of the war, and the proximity of the United States to England, and the realities of the British blockade, the United States sold far more goods to Britain than we ever did to Germany. But Britain's in a war. They don't have any money to be buying goods, so how are they buying all these goods? Through American loans. We are loaning England money so they can turn around and buy American goods with it. And because of the nature of the war, like we tried to do the same for Germany, but pretty soon we couldn't get stuff into Germany. Because of the nature of the war, our loans to Britain far outpaced our loans to Germany. And the Nye Committee said, this gave the United States a vested interest. A vested interest means, like, if you get what you want, like, you have money in the game, right? It gave us a vested interest in having who win the First World War? Britain. Because if Britain wins, we can get our loans paid back. If Germany wins, we'll get those tiny loans paid back, but we might never see British money coming back. So now this gave the United States an economic, a financial reason to be on Team Britain. Further, the Nye Committee looked into American corporate profits during World War I and found that a number of American corporations had made similar loans to England and extended credit to England. Your reading mentioned J.P. Morgan, a big banking industry, and DuPont Chemicals. You've still heard of them. They're still around today. Making huge loans and offering goods on credit to the British nation. They didn't do it to Germany because it was harder to get stuff to Germany. So those corporations have a vested interest to see the United States on Team Britain. Because if Britain loses, they might never get those loans paid back. They might never have Britain might default on their loans, right? Do corporations have influence over American political system? Yes. Absolutely. There are lobbyists today, and there were lobbyists in the 19-teens trying to influence America's push towards war. So the Nye Committee said, we were so financially tied to the European, or to Great Britain in the war, it only makes sense that we joined the war on the British side. So how do you avoid getting involved in a future war? Not only don't take sides, but you better watch who you're loaning stuff to. Watch who you're extending credit to. Because that could influence you on getting involved in a war you might not want to otherwise be involved in. This is really important, the Nye Committee, all right? Because this is going to shape how the American Congress is going to think about the issues going on in Europe going forward. This will spur a series of Neutrality Acts. This will spur a series of Neutrality Acts as the United States wants to avoid foreign entanglements. Anybody know where this harkens back to? A great American that warned future Americans about getting involved in foreign entanglements? Yes? Yeah, his farewell address, George Washington's farewell address, warning future American leaders about foreign entanglements. And this is the name of the game in 1930s, right? Avoiding foreign entanglements. How do you avoid them? By staying neutral, but not just saying, I'm not joining your war, because the Nye report says neutrality must go further than that, right? So here we go, starting in 1935. There's going to be 4 of these that we're going to talk about today. I don't really expect you to memorize, and I'm not going to question you to memorize the specifics of each of these Neutrality Acts, but you will notice that there's a trend of starting off somewhat neutral, getting a little bit more neutral, getting hyper-neutral, and getting mega-neutral, ultra-neutral. I'm making up words. Don't use these words. Okay, 1935, Neutrality Act. Oh, wow, that's a lot of neutral right there. Okay, 1935, Neutrality Act will give the American president the power to prohibit U.S. ships from carrying U.S.-made weapons to nations at war. This is a lot going on here, all right? Neutrality Act of 1935, the first Neutrality Act, gives the American president the power. It doesn't forbid it. It doesn't say American ships can't carry American weapons to countries at war. But it gives the president the power to forbid such a thing. All right? It gives him the authority to say, hey, we're not getting involved in this, so I am not going to allow American companies to put American-made guns, this word munitions, weapons, ammunition, things like that. American-made guns on American ships. We can forbid that now. Also, the 1935 Neutrality Act says that American citizens, if you are going to be getting on ships of belligerents, the word belligerent means a nation at war. So let's say England is at war. If you are an American citizen and you get on a British passenger liner, you are riding that ship, you are a passenger on that ship at your own risk. What is this probably remembering? The Lusitania, when what, 128 Americans died when that ship was sunk by a German submarine. Essentially saying, if there's some future situation where European countries are at war, and there's 100 Americans that happen to be on a ship of one of the countries at war and that ship sinks, you're on your own, American citizens. That will not pull the United States into your conflict, right? The Neutrality Acts. And this should all make sense because now we have World War I in our rearview mirror, right? So all of these things are connected to the experience of the First World War. In 1936, we will have a second Neutrality Act called the Second Neutrality Act. Yeah, that's easy for us, right? This will ban loans and credit to countries at war. Side note, a loan is me giving you money that you can use to buy stuff with. Credit is me extending you a line of credit at my store or my company, and you can buy stuff from my company with that. All right? Everybody understand the difference between a loan and a credit? All right, good. So no more loans from American government or American companies, no more extending of credit from American loans and American companies to countries at war. Do you guys notice this is the American federal government getting a little bit bigger and telling companies what they can do and what they can't do? Yeah, we aren't completely a free market nation. We should know this. Materials wouldn't be limited. So if England is at war and England needs loans for guns, well, no. Or pardon me, if they want to buy weapons and they need loans for it, we're not going to do that. We can still ship materials to them, but they have to do what with it? How are they going to get it? They have to pay cash. They have to pay up front. Because the Nye Committee said it was all of these loans that we had extended that caused us to get into the war. So they can still buy stuff, but they better pay cash for it. Third Neutrality Act in 1937. Yeah. Okay, let's call it Neutrality Act 3. Dun dun dun.
Oh, 1936 could be Neutrality Act 2.
You want to call it Neutrality Act 2 Electric Boogaloo?
Yes.
I'm down with that. Don't do it on your exam, but for our purposes, 1936 is Neutrality Act 2 Electric Boogaloo. Of course, because your pop culture references far exceed most kids' understanding. Can you explain?
Okay, so there were these breakdancing movies.
Wait, let's make sure the world can hear you.
Oh, all right. In the 80s, there were some dance movies called Breakin', and they were about breakdancing. And there was a sequel called Breakin' 2 Electric Boogaloo.
So now we have Neutrality Act 2 Electric Boogaloo. Which would be, I mean, that would be a lot more fun probably than the regular Neutrality Act. Excellent. Have you seen these movies?
I saw parts of the first one. I've not seen the second one.
Okay, the first one did not move you to even finish watching it, let alone watch the second one? Okay.
It wasn't very well.
Okay. All right, Neutrality Act 3. Dun dun dun. Would forbid the export of munitions to either side warring in the Spanish Civil War. Yes. Neutrality Act 3, Third Neutrality Act, 1937, would forbid the export of munitions, weapons of war, to either side of the Spanish Civil War. Now, we have not talked much at all about the Spanish Civil War yet. The Spanish Civil War is, brace yourselves, a civil war in Spain. We're not going to get too deep into the Civil War in Spain because it's not something we're covering in depth here. But the Spanish Civil War is going to grow larger as it is going to be pitting fascists and communists against each other in Spain. So Germany and Italy, for example, are going to be using the Spanish Civil War to try to support a fascist leader in that conflict named Francisco Franco. Germany is going to get to try out some of its future military techniques in the Spanish Civil War. We'll talk about that at a later date. The Soviet Union is going to send aid to communists in Spain, fighting in the Spanish Civil War. The United States wants to steer clear. So with the Third Neutrality Act, we say you cannot ship aid to either side in the Spanish-American War. And we're going to go even further. We will now make it unlawful. It will be against the law for American citizens to be passengers on belligerent ships. So not only would you be at your own risk, but now you are violating American law. Much like it would have been a violation of American law for you to travel to Cuba 5 years ago, or a year ago. Doesn't seem like it is anymore. So, times change. In 1937, 3 Neutrality Acts just weren't enough for Congress. So we will have the 4th Neutrality Act. In 1937, a second neutrality... Oh, let's not even do that to you. It's the 4th Neutrality Act, which happens to be another Neutrality Act in 1937. Not to be confused with Neutrality Act 2, Electric Boogaloo. All right? That's 1936, of course. I can't imagine a world where you guys remember all the specifics of each of these Neutrality Acts come May. But I can imagine a world where you guys remember there were a series of Neutrality Acts that progressively caused the United States to retract or pull away from possible entering into conflict. All right?
How many Neutrality Acts were there again?
There's 4 here, and then there's going to be a 5th one that we're going to talk about on another day. I know. 4th, in 1937, authorizes the president to determine what goods could be bought beyond munitions. Like, up to this point, we're only refusing to sell weapons of war. But what about foodstuffs? Or what about textiles that countries might use to support their military efforts? Now the president can make those kinds of decisions as well. I need to hop back to the 3rd Neutrality Act. I missed one important aspect to it. So can we, and I'm going to get you. Hop back to the 3rd Neutrality Act. We said we're not allowed to ship weapons of war to belligerents, right? Other goods were still okay to ship, so long as 2 things were met. They were paid for with cash, so no loans, and those European nations had to carry it themselves on their own ships. So this is called cash and carry. It's a part of the 3rd Neutrality Act. So they can buy it, but they better come pick it up themselves, so we're not having American ships sunk. So cash and carry is the order of the day. The 4th Neutrality Act says, whoa, 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 whoa. Now the president, regardless of cash and carry, now the president can say, beyond weapons, we're not shipping, we're not even allowing textiles to be sold, or we're not even allowing foodstuffs to be sold. Orion. Yes. Yes, belligerents at war, yes. Yep. So the question is the United States really neutral? Yes and no. We've got a series of 4 Neutrality Acts that are working to keep us out of affairs. But does that mean we're not picking sides at all? Absolutely not. Because Franklin Roosevelt, in his heart of hearts, does not march in lockstep with Congress. Franklin Roosevelt thinks we should be more involved in these international crises. And so does your friend Dr. Seuss. Do you guys remember Dr. Seuss when you were a little kid? So Dr. Seuss had his beginnings, before he was writing children's books, as a political cartoonist. And Dr. Seuss, in his cartoons, his opinions, his writings, his drawings show that he thought the United States should be getting more involved in these European affairs as well. Here, like, you guys can recognize the drawings, absolutely. You can get your ostrich bonnet here. It relieves the Hitler headache. Forget the terrible news you've read. Your mind's at ease in a new in an ostrich head. So this guy is selling ostrich head hats. And of course, what are the people doing once they put their hats on? They're burying their heads in the sand, like ostriches are wont to do, right? And what does it figuratively mean to bury your head in the sand? To ignore the issues that are happening around you. So Dr. Seuss, as the cartoonist here, certainly thinks that this is a bad thing, that the United States maybe should be getting more involved. Roosevelt is concerned about the same thing. First, in 1937. In 1937, Japan goes from just occupying and controlling a Manchurian puppet state. In 1937, they invade mainland China. This begins what is known as the Sino-Japanese War of 1937. This is really beginning the Pacific side of the Second World War. Now, what do the Neutrality Acts say about the United States sending aid to countries at war, to belligerents at war? Can't do it. But, what? Say it. Yeah, we are. We're going to aid China in this war. So how do we get around that? Yes. Very good. When Japan invaded China, they didn't declare war on China. When China moved to defend itself, it never officially declared war on Japan. Now, how do you declare war? Yeah, it's not like Michael Scott declaring bankruptcy, if you guys have ever seen that episode. It is an official diplomatic document, an official declaration of war that you issue to a foreign state that you are officially going to war with. Now, you don't necessarily have to be at war to have declared war. The United States has fought a lot of wars in the last 70 years. When's the last time we declared war? World War II, yeah, on December 8th, 1941. So Korea and Vietnam and Persian Gulf I and Persian Gulf II and Iraq and Afghanistan, these have not been officially declared wars. All right? So because they're not officially declared wars, guess what Roosevelt believes? The Neutrality Acts don't apply. And he's right, according to the letter of the law. So the United States will, and Roosevelt will authorize shipment of military aid to the Chinese defending themselves against the Japanese. What do you think the isolationists in Congress think about this? Ooh, we're not happy you found a way around our Neutrality Acts. We can see them being like the bad guys in Electric Boogaloo, or Neutrality Boogaloo, too. Oh, I'm messing it up.
They were shaking in their parachute pants.
They were shaking in their parachute pants. Very good. All right. Roosevelt also sees some threats coming with the European crisis, the growing European crisis. He's concerned about the spread of totalitarianism in Europe. When I say totalitarianism, it's a fancy word for Adolf Hitler, Benito Mussolini, individual non-democratic leaders spreading their influence over their states. But he lacks congressional and popular support for any action. A Gallup poll is done in 1937 to get the American people's views on war. And in that poll, over 70% of Americans said our entry into World War I was a mistake. And what do you think maybe shaped their views of that? Maybe the deaths and everything, sure. What do you want to say? The Depression, probably, sure. Yeah. The Nye Committee report, yeah, absolutely. And over 90% of Americans saw it to be a mistake for the United States to get involved in the current European crisis. So Franklin Roosevelt has like zero political support, zero popular support to get involved in Europe. And why does Congress, why do you think Congress is so vehemently opposed to to the involvement in this European crisis? Who does Congress have to listen to even more so than the president? Yes?
No, I was going to say, like, during times of war, that gets war powers, so the Congress.
Yeah, they could, and these are going to be evolving over time. But why must the Congress be more receptive to popular opinion than even the president? Yes?
Because they represent, like, the states.
They represent the states, they represent their individual districts, all right, for the House of Representatives. And so, how often do U.S. representatives run for re-election? Every 2 years. Every 2 years, every member of the House of Representatives is up for re-election. And what about the Senate? Every 2 years, 1/3 of the Senate is up for re-election. And those are all, by 1930s, those are all popular elections. So the people get to directly vote for their senators now. That wasn't originally how it was, right? So Roosevelt's got no support, right? In October of 1937, he's going to give a speech that is known to history as the Quarantine Speech. And this is Franklin Roosevelt saying that the United States, he does not mention any countries by name. Does not mention Germany, does not mention Japan. Does not mention Italy. But he suggests that the United States should move to quarantine aggressor states. Now, what does it mean to quarantine? Keep them aside, isolate them. This is not the first time a president will select the word quarantine because it sounds a lot better than economic warfare or sanctions or things like that. President Kennedy will do it later in the year. We'll talk about that. His goal is if we can economically isolate these countries, they might change their ways. But this is going to only strengthen isolationist sentiments. And no real action would come. Congress is still vehemently opposed to getting involved in European affairs. As the European crisis is going to worsen as we get into 1938, we remember the Sudetenland crisis of 1938. Hitler wants the Sudetenland. The Munich Pact agrees to give it to him. Hitler gets it. Czechoslovakia is supposed to be protected. But by early 1939, all of Czechoslovakia will be overrun. As the European crisis worsens, some Americans in Congress and some Americans on the street started to support the idea of supporting the Western democracies like France and Britain. There began to be more Americans that were more supportive of Roosevelt's idea of doing something about the spread of European fascism. After the Munich Pact was signed, President Roosevelt is going to direct, because it's the president gets to create his own budget. The president is going to direct $300,000 addition, or pardon me, that's nothing. $300 million more to the military budget of the United States, to the defense budget of the United States. So we're going to increase our defense budget after the Munich Pact. And the United States will also enter into secret negotiations with France in order to sell them some airplanes, some warplanes, to circumvent the navigation acts. So we're starting to see, as the crisis in Europe worsens, despite the Neutrality Acts being there, we're starting to see some in America start to think that maybe the United States should be more involved in these issues. Nobody more so than Franklin Roosevelt, though. So at the end of the day, we've got two main ideas we've got to get out of this. One, Roosevelt creating his good neighbor policy with Latin America to have better relationship with Latin America, so if a crisis comes to the Americas, we are all on the same page. Two, the American Congress and the American population being strongly against the United States intervention in European or Asian affairs. But Roosevelt wanting to get involved. All right? Roosevelt wanting to get involved. Questions, comments, concerns?